the official student group of the Institute. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program, presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you about today's program. Please let us know your feedback by contacting us on social media or via email at doleinstitute@ku.edu. To view past programs, visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org, and a video of today's presentation will be available on our website soon. We would like to encourage each of you to consider becoming friends of the Dole Institute. Our friends help keep our programs free and open and support archive research and our student activities. Please contact us if you are interested. After the presentation, we'll have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you're able and ask just one brief question. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming the Assistant Professor at the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Dr. Jonathan Abel.
Afternoon, everybody. Dr. David Mills is an Assistant Professor at the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College. He comes to us after having served for 10 years in the U.S. Army as an Air Defense Artillery Officer, a PhD from North Dakota State University. And he specializes in the early Cold War period in the United States. He is the author of Cold War in a Cold Land, Fighting Communism on the Northern Plains, as well as Operation Snowbound, Life Behind the Blizzards of 1949, two excellent books on that topic. And he is going to talk today about arguably the only competent general of World War I, General Sir John Monash.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. Hey, thanks everybody for coming out. And so like all good speakers, I'm going to start off with a disclaimer, which is I think I misunderstood the assignment when it came out, which was the series is Greatest Generals You Never Heard Of. I thought I was supposed to pick a general I never heard of and figure it out. And so this is going to be a bit of discovery learning today, is because I don't know a whole lot more about General Monash than what I'm going to share with you today. So please keep your expectations low, particularly when we get to the question and answer period. But anyway. All right, so I wanted to give a quick shout out. This is a great book. Monash's masterpiece, The Battle of Hummel, and the 93 minutes that changed the world. This is all about the battle that we're going to talk about today, and it's it's available in an audio book, and I'm bringing this up for a couple of reasons. All right, how's that? So I bring up the book for a couple of reasons. So the publisher won't sue me for copyright infringement for using it on the video, but also to give you an idea of where you can go to get a little bit more information about this topic. Really, I wasn't dancing or jitterbugging or anything. It just fell off. So a little bit of context here. Remember, World War I is it's two enormous armies in the West: the British, the French, and eventually the Americans on the Western Front fighting the Germans. There's also the Eastern Front, the Russians and the Germans. That's quite a bit different. That was always a war of maneuver. On the Western Front, it's a stalemate. You've got trench warfare, two enormous armies facing each other, and they weren't doing this because they wanted to. In fact, the last thing that they wanted was this stalemate. They were trying to figure out everything that they could to get out of this stalemate. What they wanted was to get back to a war of maneuver so that one side could eventually win. As it was, this stalemate could go on indefinitely. And so many generals have been castigated or ridiculed for being heartless individuals who just kept doing the same thing over and over again, send the boys over the top, and these frontal attacks where people got slaughtered. And that's a little unfair, I think, because generals and armies were trying lots of different things to try and get back to this war of maneuver, particularly turning to technology. It's kind of interesting to think about the airplane, which was only about 10, 12 years old when the war begins, and by the time that the war is in its in 1916, 1917, airplanes are becoming obsolete in 6 months. They're inventing brand new airplanes with better engines and completely revolutionizing airplanes. Tanks, for example, were also these brand new inventions. The mother of necessity, right, is invention. And so you've got lots of folks turning to technology and different folks. And the reason that we remember Monash, so this was a very long way to get to why we're here today, right? Monash was a guy who envisioned using tanks and planes and infantry and artillery in a very coordinated manner. Folks had tried this before, but tanks were just not up to it before this. They were breaking down constantly. They were underpowered. Transmissions just not up to the task. Airplanes not up to the task, etc. Finally, by the summer of 1918, Monash has the opportunity to change the way that we view combined arms warfare. And so John Monash is quite popular in Australia. There's a university named after him. I had the opportunity to speak to some folks in the audience who've been to Monash Hospital, and several cities named after him, a highway named after him, numerous schools named after him, a university is named after him. But this was 100 years ago, so our memories are fading. And so if Australia is struggling to remember John Monash, I suspect that we probably don't know much more about him here, which is why I picked him. But he was a brilliant planner and corps commander during World War I, probably one of the most successful commanders to come out of World War I that you never heard of. To maybe put this in perspective, Bernard Montgomery, the field marshal coming out of World War II, said that, called John Monash the best World War I general on the Western Front. That kind of, if that means anything. It's Bernard Montgomery, so that, it's problematic. But so Monash was born in Melbourne. By the way, to our Australian friends, I apologize for the butchering the pronunciation of your cities and your favorite son here. Please understand that I'm an American. That's what we do. So Monash was born in Melbourne in 1865. He was the son of Jewish parents who were immigrants from Poland. What is now Poland. His family spoke German at home. He read it, he spoke it, he wrote it. It was a secret that he particularly held pretty closely, especially once the war began. He did get married to Hannah Victoria Moss in 1891. They had one daughter, Bertha, born in 1893. He was an incredibly intelligent young man. His teachers in school all encouraged him to go to college. He earned a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in engineering by 1895, and a doctoral degree in engineering in 1921, so after the war. He worked as a civil engineer before the war. He was actually quite instrumental in introducing reinforced concrete into bridges and railway structures and other infrastructure projects in Australia just prior to the war. He also, before the war, he joined the Australian militia, kind of similar to our National Guard, I think. And he rose to the rank of full colonel and the commander of a reserve brigade, or a National Guard brigade, by 1912. So the war breaks out in the summer of 1914. The Australians are pretty quick to send their first division by October of that year to Europe. He, however, doesn't. He takes command of a brigade, and they don't get to leave actually until December of 1912. And so pretty quickly he takes command of this brigade. Initially there's a fair amount of grumbling about his appointment as brigade commander, largely due to his Jewish and German background. He's going to face quite a bit of ostracism due to his ethnicity throughout his career. But nothing ever happened. He remained the brigade commander. Once Monash and his brigade get on a ship in December of 1915, the first place that they end up going is Egypt, actually. They go and simply begin training, and some more training until April of 1915, when they are sent to Gallipoli. The Gallipoli Campaign, as most of you are probably aware, is a pretty tough go. There's a whole lot of stalemate, a whole lot of casualties there. And even though Monash's brigade goes in as a division reserve initially, they are in the thick of the fighting before they know it. And so this is Monash in Gallipoli. You can see he's no disrespect intended, but he's a pretty hefty fellow. He ends up losing quite a bit of weight during the Gallipoli campaign, just because he's working pretty hard, and he has a fair amount of trouble navigating the trenches with his size, and so they face a number of problems. Their maps are all outdated. The terrain is pretty tough, as you can see from this picture. It's pretty hilly. It's pretty sandy. So the losses that they start enduring during the Gallipoli campaign are pretty horrendous pretty quickly, and so but even though his unit has taken all these losses, he makes a name for himself pretty quickly as well. Remember, he's a reserve officer that was probably promoted above his station, a lot of people thought. But he was a really intelligent guy, well known for his planning, known for his unit's ability to get things done. And so in July of 1915, he is promoted to the rank of brigadier general. But rumors begin circulating that he's a German spy based on his ethnicity and his background. But nothing ever came of it. By August of 1915, his brigade started out with almost 3,400 soldiers. And by August of that year, he's down to 1,400. So he's lost about 2,000 soldiers out of his brigade. So they are pulled out of the line. They are sent to Egypt again, where his unit performs guard duty along the Suez Canal. And he finds out that he was named Companion of the Order of the Bath. You see there are 3 degrees of a celebration here: the Knight Grand Cross, the Knight Commander, and the Companion. So the 3rd level is what he's named to. And what I know about British heraldry, you can put into a thimble. And so that is about the extent of my knowledge of this. So he's called Sir John Monash after this. So the 4th Brigade returns to Gallipoli in November of 1915. However, the purpose of the campaign is largely overcome by events. The casualties have been horrendous, the successes few and far between, and it's the following month in December that they decide to essentially end the Gallipoli Campaign. And so Monash and his brigade are pulled out of Gallipoli and sent back to Egypt. So, kind of the interesting facet is on that April 25th, which is the anniversary of the day that the Australians and the New Zealanders came ashore on Gallipoli. Monash and his unit celebrate that anniversary, which becomes known as Anzac Day today, which is the Australian version of our Memorial Day and Veterans Day, kind of combined into one. And so he hands out red flowers, red poppies, to those soldiers who were there on April 25th and came ashore in Gallipoli, and then blue flowers to those who had come later. And there were a whole lot of folks who came later, remember. So Monash his brigade is transferred to the Western Front. You can see there pretty early on, there's the trenches that they're occupying are not too terribly elaborate, but he's promoted again to Major General the following month. So in the summer of 1916, he's promoted again. He takes command of the 3rd Australian Division, where things again are pretty tough. They take a whole lot of casualties, but Monash has obviously caught the attention of those senior ranking officers above him. He's well known, perhaps his engineering degree has something to do with it, but he's well known for his meticulous planning and his overwhelming desire to do everything possible to protect those infantry soldiers in their offensives. Whatever he can do, and he's really creative when it comes to putting these offensives together. All right, so hang on to your hats, because we're gonna switch theaters here. We're transferring to the Eastern Front now. And we've fast forwarded a couple of years. It's now it's spring of 1918. The Russians are having a whole lot of problems at home. Perhaps you've heard of the Russian Revolution, right? So it's kind of hard to have a civil war and a shooting war with an enemy at the same time. And so the Russians negotiate an end to the war on the Eastern Front at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on May 3rd, I believe it is, 1918. This allows the Germans to transfer hundreds of thousands of soldiers to the Western Front. They figure, this is our opportunity. The Americans are coming, but they're not really here yet. And if we can finish the war in a couple of months, then it will all have been worth it. And so, literally within about 3 weeks of the Eastern Front collapsing, Germany has transferred all of these soldiers to the Western Front, and they begin spring offensives in April, May, and June of 1918. They begin their spring offensives. And you can kind of see from this map, the solid line is where the trench lines were. These were where they had stabilized, and those dotted lines are how far the Germans were able to push the Allied armies back. So they had made tremendous gains in some areas, but they had never achieved a breakthrough, which would have spelled disaster for the Allied armies. By June of 1918, the Germans had essentially culminated. They had lost the advantage that they had in personnel and equipment and material and that sort of thing. Those offensives, this is as far as they could get. And so the Allies naturally have to counterattack and take back all of that territory that they had just lost. And so there are big counteroffensives coming, but before you can launch those big counteroffensives, you got to launch a couple of smaller ones to kind of set the stage. And this is where the British Fourth Army commander, a guy named Sir Henry Rawlinson, is looking at this area of Hummel, where the Australians are, and he says, we got to take this area of Hummel because of it's key terrain. If you take Hummel, you can see everywhere that the enemy would approach, right? So you got to take that key terrain. Now, in June of 1918, Monash gets promoted again to Corps Commander. He's now a Lieutenant General commanding the Australian Corps, which is the largest organization, the largest corps on the Western Front. As if folks were upset that he got promoted to 1-star general and then 2-star general, imagine how they reacted when he was promoted to a 3-star general and commander of the Corps. A whole lot of other people wanted that command, and they were angry that Monash got it. So they begin a whispering campaign directed at Monash, saying he's incompetent, he's overrated, he's pompous, but worst of all, he does not enjoy the support of any of the officers underneath him. They all hate him. So he should be relieved. And so just so happens that Prime Minister Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister of Australia, is coming to France that summer to talk to the Australian soldiers, lift morale, that sort of thing. And one of the things that he's planning on doing is relieving Monash of his command. He's listened to the rumors, he believes them. We got to do something about this. But first, General Rawlinson has put Monash in charge of planning for this Battle of Hummel. First, we're going to see how incompetent he is by sitting through this plan, the briefing of this plan, and so we just simply have more evidence against him when it comes time for firing. Well, guess what happens? It's a brilliant plan, and Hughes knows it. So, in the meantime, after this plan is briefed, he goes around and he starts talking to all of these officers who supposedly hate Monash and believe that he's been promoted beyond his abilities. To a man, every one of them says that, oh no, we're lucky to have Monash. The man is a genius. He understands things in a way that nobody else can, and he's the most patient person in the world. He's not egotistical. He's not annoying. He's a very conscientious and courteous individual, actually. Well, Billy Hughes just kind of loses it on some of these folks that have been talking about Monash behind his back, and he accuses them to their face of lying and putting their own needs above the war effort and that sort of thing. So, needless to say, Monash is quite secure in his position as Corps Commander. All right, so please bear with me. Don't expect you to read all of this on your own, but it's kind of important to see what Monash, this is in sum what Monash thinks about his planning process. So it says, Monash sees combined arms warfare as a possible solution to the dilemma of this stalemate in the trenches. So he writes, the true role of infantry is not to expend itself upon heroic physical effort, not to wither away under merciless machine gun fire, not to impale itself on hostile bayonets, nor tear itself to pieces in hostile entanglements, but on the contrary, to advance under maximum possible protection of the maximum possible array of mechanical resources in the form of guns, machine guns, tanks, mortars, and airplanes, to advance with as little impediment as possible, to be relieved as far forward as possible of the obligation to fight their way forward, to march resolutely, regardless of the din and tumult of battle, to the appointed goal, and there to hold and defend the territory gained, and to gather in the form of prisoners, guns, and stores, the fruits of victory. In other words, everything that we can do to protect that soldier on the ground going forward, we have got to do. There is no effort too strenuous when it comes to saving lives. So Monash was a big advocate, a big fan of tanks, actually, which didn't have a great reputation at this point in the war. So he's kind of struggling with exactly how to employ tanks doctrinally. I mean, it hasn't been done yet. But he's looking at these things, and you can just imagine the countless number of infantry officers looking across no man's land saying, gee, if only there was some way that I could get from here to there without getting my men shot, without having to suffer the shrapnel, if I could, bring machine guns with me and not have to carry them piece by piece because they're so heavy. I mean, this is the mother of invention, right? And so he sees a lot of potential in these tanks. Now, fortunately for Monash, is a whole lot of these problems with tanks have been worked out up to this point. So the first tanks are introduced in 1916. We talked about this. They're terrible. This is the new Mark V tank. It's got a bigger engine. It's got a better crew, a bigger crew. You can see the cannon sticking out the side of it. If it looks familiar, this should look a whole lot like the tank from Indiana Jones, where he's fighting the Nazis in the interwar period. That's not a coincidence. I think it's a little bit later model, but it probably looks pretty familiar, right? So Monash, he was one for quotes. So he says, a perfected modern battle plan is like a musical composition, where the various arms and units are like the instruments, and the tasks they perform are the repetitive musical phrases. Every individual unit must make its entry precisely at the proper moment and play its phrase in general harmony. I mean, that kind of sums it up, right? He sees combined arms as something that hasn't worked yet, but it's got great potential. And so this is the village of Hummel today. And so really what they're going for in this battle is not so much the village itself, it's the high ground right in front of the village. And so this is the objective. But so in planning, in Monash's plan, he's essentially using this combined arms strategy, and in a nutshell, what he's planning on doing is he wants the artillery to do a whole lot of the heavy lifting. And so he came up with this kind of ingenious idea, I think. So 2 weeks before the battle, every morning about 0300, he starts just pummeling the enemy positions with high explosive and smoke and gas. And for 2 weeks, every morning at 0300, they get pummeled by artillery until they just expect it. Except on July 4th, by the way, that's not a coincidence. He picked that day because he's working with Americans, which we'll get to. But on July 4th, the day of the attack, he again, 0300, he begins the artillery prep. The Germans think, well, here it comes. Except he doesn't use gas on this day. Obviously, you don't want your own soldiers to have to traverse through mustard gas and phosgene and all of those problems, right? But the Germans think, well, it's just a typical day. They're hitting us with artillery again. And so they put on their protective masks, which impede their hearing, impede their sight, and impede their situational awareness, what's going on around them. So Monash believes that this will give them a little bit of an edge and give the tanks an opportunity to get just a little bit closer to the enemy positions before the enemy can hear the tanks. So this is one of the first. I think that this might even be one of the original maps for the plan. So you can see the village of Hummel here, but take a look at this red line. This is the forward deployment of enemy soldiers. Kind of looks like I think it looks like a man in profile, but they call this the Pear Trench, which is up here. So some folks think it kind of looks like the one side of a pear. But so you've got the village of Hummel, which is kind of right there in the center there, and just to the south of Hummel, you've got a couple of different woods. This is the the Hummel Woods and the VA Woods, just to the south. And then just in front of Hummel, kind of where that big nose is a place called the Pear Trench. So these are going to be the three main objectives at the Battle of Hummel. So the city, the town itself, the Pear Trench out to the front of it, and then the woods just to the south of it. So this is the first offensive that Monash has been truly in charge of planning, and he comes up with a number of innovative ideas. Not only the idea of the artillery, which conditions the Germans to expect to be hit every morning at 03, and the 0300, and they won't be able to distinguish a harassing fire from the initiation of the offensive, but he also has his Air Force or his air liaison folks situate or configure on the wings of their airplanes the ability to strap supplies to them and at just the right time drop parachutes of ammunition and medical supplies forward of into the battle area itself. Absolutely never been done before. They find sewing machines and make the parachutes themselves. They have mechanics who use a little bit of ingenuity and come up with a contraption that will actually release these at just the right time. They use they've stripped some tanks and used them as supply tanks so that you can put a whole lot more ammunition on those things rather than having folks run up and carrying a box of ammo here and there. I mean, they literally are able to replicate the abilities of about 1,200 supply soldiers, bringing stuff up by hand, automating it, dropping it by airplane, and using those tanks. So he does a couple of things that are also pretty innovative when it comes to his plan. And one of those things is he comes up with this plan, he publishes it, but then he brings everybody together. He brings the air commanders, the Air Force, for lack of a better term, the airplane commanders, he brings them in. He brings battalion and brigade commanders in. He brings the artillery commanders in. He brings in the supply and the logistics folks and says, here's the plan. How can we make this better? How can we improve upon it? What do you see that can possibly go wrong? And they hash this out. They spend hours going over the plan that he had come up with and then making sure that everybody not only understands it, but how can we make it even better? And so to lead the offensive, here's a little bit better map so you can kind of see Hummel there in the upper right. You can see the woods a little bit clearer, and then also there's another objective just to the south of those woods. And so you've also got up to the north, you've got a distraction with another unit doing an attack a little bit further south, so the Germans don't really understand where the main attack comes. So you can see maybe you can see the Pear Trench there, kind of in the nose of the man in profile. You can see the town of La Hummel, and then the woods. So those are the three main objectives we're going to talk about. So this was not a large battle. The Germans only had something less than 6,000 soldiers in this area that they needed to push out. So for the offensive, you can see the Australian 11th Brigade, the Australian 4th Brigade, and the Australian 6th Brigade are selected to lead these attacks. And so one of the major problems that you've got with this attack is the idea that nobody trusts the tanks. 10,000 Australians were killed in a previous battle when the plan depended on the tanks getting through the mud and the debris and all of that to provide support to the Australian infantry as it attacked. It didn't happen. So a whole lot of folks the infantrymen particularly, are pretty hesitant to put their faith in the British, no less, tankers who are out there. So Monash, for several weeks before the attack kicks off, he makes the tankers and the infantry, the British tank corps and the Australian infantry, called diggers, he makes them actually live together. He makes them train together. He makes the tankers take the Australians for joy rides across the countryside on all their tanks. They let the infantrymen get in there and steer them and shoot the machine guns and all of that. So by the time it's all over, it was an extremely successful idea because the tankers put the name of the Australian infantry that they're supporting. They put that name on their tank. Right, and they paint the colors of the Australian regiments on their tanks and that sort of thing. So you've accomplished the darn near impossible by getting those infantrymen and those tankers to believe in each other and understand that they will not simply abandon each other when the going gets tough. So here's a picture of British and Australians out there with a tank. So they're out there, I wouldn't say joyriding. We like to call cross-training is a term we like to use rather than joyriding. All right, so we talked a little bit about the plan, which centered around the artillery. So just like it happened every morning for the previous 2 weeks, on July 4th, the morning of the battle, the artillery was just going to start hitting these targets just like it had every other morning. But after about 10 minutes, it was going to pull back pretty quickly until it's about 200 yards in front of the infantry units, which are all on line. And then the idea is then the rolling barrage. So over the course of about 3 minutes, the barrage will progress about 100 yards every 3 minutes. So the infantry is to keep back far enough that they don't get hit by the artillery, but the artillery can chew up a whole lot of the enemy outposts in front of them, force the enemy to seek cover and stay out of the way. And so hopefully the artillery will do a whole lot of the hard work, the heavy lifting in this plan. But eventually, if whatever the artillery doesn't take out, then the infantry and the armor are going to have to keep up with that. Now, one of the things that Monash does is he puts the infantry company commanders in charge of the tankers. So the tankers are not the armor is not simply an independent unit doing whatever they want. They need to keep up with the infantry and go where the infantry tells them to. And it actually ends up working out pretty well. Over 600 British and French field guns are participating in this battle, and if you looked, it's only a few miles wide, this area of operation. So Monash was adamant that the infantry would not be sacrificed in an unprotected advance. Here you can see American and Australian troops fighting together at the Battle of Hummel. So Monash has manpower problems. For example, one of the battalions that he has starts out with over 1,000 soldiers, right? And including replacements, by the time of this battle, he's got 440 in this battalion. He's got less than half of the assigned strength in each of the battalions that he has to fight. He said, hey, I need people. Hey, you know who's not doing anything? Those Americans who just got over here. They haven't been involved in any of the fighting. What if we take them under our wing and we show them the ropes and we incorporate them into our plan and we get some Americans to help us out? And so his boss, General Rawlinson, the fourth British Army commander, says, you know what, that's a great idea. I approve. So what they did was they went and talked to an American Corps commander who said, hey, that is a great idea. How about we give you 2 companies? And they said, that would be great. So each company has 250 soldiers. That would be great. You know what would be better? 4 companies. They said, okay, we can do that. So they come back. So Rawlinson comes back. He says, Monash, I got great news. I got you 4 companies. And he says, you know, I got 10 battalions in this fight. What would be really cool is if we could have 10 companies of Americans, one for each of the battalions. Remember, each company's got 250 guys in it, which is almost as much as each battalion has at this point. So they decide they are going to shoot the moon, and they go ask for the Corps commander for 10 companies. And he says, okay. So the Americans come and encamp with the Australians. The Americans have not been, at least these Americans, had not been in battle at this point. They were half trained or mostly trained, I guess you could say. Well, whereas the Australians had been in the front lines or in the trenches for the past couple of years. So the Americans are pretty humble when they come and they meet up with the Australians, and the Australians are pretty lenient when it comes to working with the Americans. They're patient. They are, and the Americans and the Australians get along really, really well. And then General Pershing hears about this plan to use Americans under the command of the Australians. And so I got a little ahead of myself. So this, you can see the Americans and the Australians are, in the days before the attack, they're out training. That's actually General Monash standing in the back, the taller of the two. All right, so 2 days before the attack, General Pershing hears about the idea of using Americans under the command of Australians. And Pershing is absolutely adamant that we are not going to do that. But Pershing has spent his entire time in France trying to keep the French from stealing all of his guys. At one point, the French tell Pershing, look, we don't really need any of your officers. Just send us all of your soldiers, and we'll incorporate them into our army. We'll make sure that they get where they need to go. And Pershing's like, oh, heck no, we are not doing that. We are going to fight as an American unit under American leadership. And then what happens? Now it's not the French that he's got to worry about, it's the Australians. So Pershing says, no, we're not going to do that. Send all those guys back the day before the battle is set to begin. You can imagine how this goes over. And so Rawlinson says to Monash, hey, we need to talk. I just got a phone call from the Americans. And so they meet up, and they begin discussing what they should do. The Americans are adamant, you got to send them all back. And Monash says, well, first of all, a lot of these units are already too far forward. We can't get the word to those guys. And I want to keep them all, but definitely I got to keep the guys who are already in the front lines. And so Rawlinson says, well, can you get word to the guys in the rear, in the reserve formations? And he says, I can. I don't want to, but I can. And he says, well, do it. And so there are 6 American companies who are in the reserves of the Australian order of battle, right? And so all 6 of those companies are given orders to withdraw, to pull out and head back to the American lines. Some of the soldiers, onesies and twosies here and there, say, I'm not doing it. Give me an Australian uniform and don't tell anybody you know me. And then so some of the guys actually participated in the battle while wearing Australian uniforms. Most of the guys ended up going back, right? So 6 out of the 10 companies end up going back to their own lines. So that afternoon, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the Americans figure out not all of the companies have come back yet. So they call Rawlinson again. Hey, where are our guys? So he calls Monash, says, hey, we got to meet. And Monash says, I am under no circumstances am I giving these guys back. It's too late. We can't get the word to those guys. If we send the Americans back, the fate of the battle is in doubt, right? So Rawlinson says, well, there are bigger issues at work here. We've got to work with the Americans. The Australians and the Americans have to have bigger issues than just a single battle. You got to think big. And Monash says, this is the start of something much bigger, right? You've got to support this. In fact, you need to ignore the order from Pershing. And Rawlinson says, I might be relieved. Have you ever thought of that? And Monash says, I'm okay with that. We have bigger issues, right? So finally, Rawlinson negotiates a kind of splits the middle. And what he says is, all right, so it's 5 o'clock now. If nobody calls us by 7 o'clock, then okay, we'll keep the Americans. About 6:45, the phone rings. It's General Douglas Haig, the British commander. He says, what are you guys doing with those Americans? And Rawlinson talks to him for about 15 minutes, explains the entire situation to him. And finally, Rawlinson, or General Haig, the British commander in Europe at the time, he eventually comes around. He says, the attack must be launched as prepared, even if a few American detachments cannot be got out before 0 hour. And so what essentially happens is everybody pretends that they can't get the word to the Americans up front. Well, we would if we could, but if anybody asked, we couldn't get the word to the Americans. And so this battle kicks off with those 4 American companies who were left in with the Australians. And so the attack begins right on schedule at 3 o'clock in the morning, just as Monash had talked about. It looks like harassment fire at the beginning, and then the artillery shifts just as it's supposed to, and the infantry and the armor are following behind just as they're supposed to, just like it's been laid out, just like it's been planned. The Germans had put on their protective masks, thinking that the fire was just like every other day, thinking that there was going to be gas. There wasn't. At the same time that the artillery starts moving forward, the Americans, or the French and British air squadrons begin dropping 25-pound bombs. Of course, that we have a ways to go before technology will allow us those 500-pound bombs like we see in World War II and even later, right? So 25-pound bombs are pretty sizable for the technology that we've got. So you've got artillery and close air support and tanks and infantry all working together in a synchronization that Monash would liken to a symphony movement. So the first place that we talk about is the Pear Trench. Take a look at these guys. This kind of sums it all up. Exhausted Australians in the Pear Trench. So the Pear Trench, as I said, it gets its name because of the shape. It's an important objective. The 15th Battalion of the 4th Brigade was assigned to assault the position with the assistance of 3 tanks. The tanks and the infantry are exactly where they're supposed to be, but some of the infantry has gotten a little ahead. In fact, some of the infantry will actually get too close to the artillery. They're too far forward, and friendly fire is going to take out a number of Allied soldiers. So they get to the Pear Trench a little bit before the tanks, and they discover that the artillery that was supposed to take out the barbed wire and supposed to soften up the target fell a little bit short, and it didn't quite get there. So the Germans are not only has the barbed wire in front of them not been blown up and ways through it prepared, and not only have the Germans not been taken out of their fighting positions, but they are absolutely focused on the Australians and the Americans coming up. And so they have quite a battle on their hands for quite a while until the tanks begin to show up. So the Allies they're waiting for, they're trying to buy time until the Allies, until the tanks and the infantry that's a little bit behind them can actually come up. And so the Germans are firing machine guns at all these Australians, and it turns out that the area around Hummel had been planted in wheat. And so in order for anybody to see anything, you gotta stand up, which makes a darn nice target if you follow my drift. And so in order for anybody to do any kind of shooting with for the Australians, they had to stand up with a machine gun, kind of like Rambo, and shoot standing up, which caused an awful lot of problems until this guy named Harry Diesel, and any relation? No? All right. We have a young man named Diesel in the back of the room. So Harry Diesel takes matters into his own hands. He charges one of the machine guns with just a revolver, kills 2 of the members of the machine gun crew, takes the 3rd prisoner. About this time, not too much longer, the tanks begin to show up, and German soldiers decide that they should surrender. So Harry Diesel wins the Victoria Cross that day, and then we switch our fighting to the woods, the Pear Woods and the Hummel Woods, just outside of Hummel. And so those 2 patches of woods have to be taken, and the infantry hits the woods first, and within 6 minutes, the tanks begin to show up right on schedule, and so the tank crews really rescue the infantrymen from a long, bloody confrontation that they pretty quickly prove their worth as mobile machine gun pits, and so they. Sorry, I thought I just saw something in the back. And so what they do is, so one of the infantrymen comes up to one of the tanks, literally knocks on the back. They have a kind of a doorbell, a bell that you can ring. And so the tanker opens up the back door and he says, "Hey, there's a machine gun pit right in front of us, about 100 yards in front." No problem. So they drive the tank up and kind of just do a pivot around and around and around until they squish the machine gun and pit and into smithereens. And so the tanks do that in a couple of different times. Rather than engaging with guns or machine guns or anything, they literally just drive over the top of the machine guns, and as they pivot around in circles, they just kind of grind the whole thing into dust. And so that convinces a whole lot of people to surrender as well. And so finally we get to the Battle of Hummel, and you guessed it, there's another hero that we need to talk about. So the German infantry is entrenched inside the little town there. And so Lance Corporal Thomas Axford, in order to, so the attack stalls out into the town, and Axford takes a rifle, shoots about 10 of the Germans holding this machine gun pit, takes 6 as prisoners, and he too wins the Victoria Cross that day. All right, so the consolidation that takes place after the battle is over. Once Hummel was taken, a short halt was called. Spotty resistance is cleaned up. After 10 minutes, the offensive resumes. They finish cleaning out the rest of the town and the woods around it by about 6 o'clock. By 7 o'clock in the morning, everything has been completely taken over and completely conquered. The plan has worked. And in fact, the entire operation from beginning to successful consolidation takes just 93 minutes. 3 minutes more than Monash calculated that it would take. Supplies are brought up in these 4 resupply tanks. By 0445, reconnaissance airplanes are begin taking photographs to update maps for headquarters, and the resupply tanks come up and bring ammunition and food and everything that the soldiers need. And so the last battle that I failed to mention was just south of the woods. There was Corporal Thomas Pope, who was a National Guardsman who rushed an enemy machine gun position, bayoneted 2 of its crew, and held off the enemy until the tanks arrived. And so he's going to win the Medal of Honor eventually, but we'll talk about that in just a second. So casualties, taking of Hummel cost the Allies 1,400 casualties in total, including 39 Americans killed, 196 wounded. The Germans, as you can see from this picture, lost about 2,000 men, including 43 officers and 1,500 enlisted, captured or killed, and they lose a whole lot of equipment as well. So as for General Pershing, what did he think about these 4 American companies participating in this battle? He was actually quite proud of the Americans and the way that they had handled themselves that day. So he watched as King George V awards the Distinguished Conduct Medal to Corporal Tom Pope and 2 other doughboys for their valor at Hummel, while 4 others got the Military Cross and 11 received the Military Medal, British or Australian medals. But in his memoir entitled My Experiences in the World War, Pershing writes, somewhat of a surprise, and though the behavior of our troops was splendid, the battle's immediate effect was to cause me to make the instructions so positive that nothing of this kind could ever happen again. In other words, hey, great job, don't ever do that again, right? So later on April 22nd, 1919, Pershing himself will present Pope with the Medal of Honor for his actions at Hummel that day. And so the Battle of Hummel was small but significant. It laid the groundwork for battles that were going to follow immediately after this, and kind of paved the way for how combined arms should work, and some of the principles to employ when trying to coordinate infantry and armor and artillery and close air support and all of that. And so it proves that these lessons prove themselves later on, only a few weeks later at the Battle of Amiens, where on a much larger scale with hundreds of tanks and thousands of artillery pieces and hundreds of thousands of soldiers on each side involved in this battle, this is an overwhelming success for the Allies and shows the Germans that they simply can't win. So this battle takes place in August of 1918, and as we know, by November, actually the end of October, they begin negotiating for peace to end the war. So for his service during this battle, during the war particularly, so you see King George V here is knighting Sir John Monash. He gets the next higher award of what do they call that? Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St. Michael and St. George in 1919. So he receives numerous other awards from the Belgians and the French and the Americans and that. But he dies in 1931 of a heart attack. He's given a state funeral. An estimated 300,000 Australians turn out for his funeral. The nation's largest funeral crowd to that time came and to pay their respects. After a Jewish service, a 17-gun salute, he's buried in Brighton General Cemetery, and as a final sign of humility, despite his achievements, honors, and titles, he instructed that his tombstone simply bear his name and dates of birth and death. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Sir John Monash. So, thank you. And so if you have any questions, please direct them to Dr. Abel in the back of the room. Yes, sir.
I have a microphone.
What did he do after the war, since he obviously was not a career soldier? Did he have an afterlife, I guess you might say?
He did. Right? He gets his PhD in engineering in 1921, and then he goes back to becoming an engineer and working throughout Australia. Yeah, he was kind of the epitome of the citizen soldier who, I mean, he was in the National Guard before. He does really well, and as we kind of talked about, he was a pretty humble guy that he just wanted to go back and be an engineer and build things, and didn't really harp on his achievements, even though in his lifetime they were building things and naming them after him, right? Hospitals and schools and of course highways probably came later, but he was recognized as a true hero and one of Australia's most popular soldiers or people in the aftermath of the war. So that's about all I know about the end of the war. So
the attacking force in the battle you described had tanks. Did the defending force have any armor?
no.
It was just strictly infantry in trenches.
No, yeah, that is correct. The Germans didn't build many of their own tanks. In fact, any of the tanks that they had were usually captured French tanks that they'd fix up and employ. And so the Germans were quite interested in how the tanks worked, and they looked at these things going, that thing's got a lot of potential. We could come up with ways of using that, but they didn't build many of their own during the war. No.
So what was the date of this battle?
This was July 4th, 1918.
And how many troops did he have?
He had about 7,000 total. That's Americans and Australians, and the Germans had something less than 6,000, about 5,500. So, in the overall scheme of things, not too out of whack but when you've got tanks and just the way that he's employing them, right? Everything is timed. All right, so at this minute, the tanks are going to cross this phase line, the artillery is going to be here, and the infantry is going to be here, and they've choreographed the entire thing, down to the minute. It doesn't really go that well. It's only off by about 3 minutes, actually, by the end of this thing, but he envisioned, so what makes Monash so memorable is the way that he envisions the infantry and the armor and the close air support and all of these folks working together in a timed, synchronized way, achieving these small incremental achievements and hitting these marks at just the right point so that everything comes together, rather than just simply depending on the infantry to, like they had throughout the war, just get up, run over the trench, and see what happens. So.
Was that method used in other battles right after this?
Yes, absolutely, like the Battle of Amiens. So the synchronization is the big piece. Up to this point, you had the tank corps, right? Nobody's really sure what to do with these things. Should they operate by themselves? Are they mobile pillboxes? Are they infantry support vehicles? What are these things? And so Monash is really the first guy to envision the infantry and the army and the armor working together. One not necessarily subordinate to the other, but they each have different strengths, right? And so the infantry can keep the tanks from being blown up by other infantrymen, right? And the tanks can blow up or grind into dust, machine gun pits as they come across them. So he's really the first guy to envision, all of these different elements coming together. And so the Battle of Amiens is really the culmination of this idea of combined arms, and it's such an overwhelming defeat for the Germans. This is what fundamentally ends the war, when they realize that they can't keep losing like this.
what's amazing is if I get my times right, about 4 months after this battle, they sued for peace. The Germans. I mean, that was pretty dramatic that they could see the handwriting on the wall.
That's right. And so these spring offensives, I mean, they kind of gamble with they bet the farm that they can end this war quickly before the Americans can really be a decisive factor. And so they try, and they make a lot of gains, as we saw on that map, but they were not able to turn that into a decisive victory. And then with these decisive losses, I mean, that changes the game as well. So maybe the British and the French don't have to fundamentally win the entire war at once, but the way that they've lost this battle and the way they don't have the men, the material, and the resources to be able to come back at these counterattacks and these huge losses that they're experiencing. It's as you said, it's the handwriting on the wall. They figure out they can't keep doing this. And so we like to say, so Monash's supporters like to say that his techniques really led to those victories which pushed the Germans to that final conclusion. So.
In the book To Conquer Hell, which is about the American in that last 2 months and things like that, they mention a little bit about the Renault tanks, and that's what were used in American sector, but they weren't very effective.
No, I mean, you just never had the need to have something. I mean, this.
Communication problems between the French and the Americans too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, communicate. You've got technology moving at a speed the world has never seen before, and everything is advancing technologically, except for communications. Right? You've got the ability to kill people on a scale the world has never seen before. And yet you can't talk from here to there to change anything, right? So communications is going to be a fundamental problem. In fact, those tanks that we talked about, they had a hatch that you could open up so you could launch a pigeon. So that's how you would communicate with higher headquarters. Google it. There's a picture of a hand with a pigeon coming out of the back of a tank, and he's releasing it.
We did the Lost Battalion.
Yeah, you're right. So interesting. Anything else? All right. Well, thanks so much for coming out, everybody.